grab your bolter and chainsword, because it's time for a crusade. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we like to talk about all the best ways to get the most out of your miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be turning back to the Knights of Sigismund once more, as we'll be talking Black Templars Crusader squads. We'll take a look at their new rules from Faith and Fury, any obvious synergies and combos we can employ, and how I would personally run them on the tabletop. Now in the background, the Crusader squads form the backbone of the Black Templars army, in place of the more typical tactical squad that's employed by the more Codex adhering chapters. The Black Templars Marines in training, their scouts that they call Neophytes, are deployed alongside their regular battle brothers or initiates. The Neophytes must prove their mettle in battle before he is allowed to become a fully fledged initiate, and he trains under one initiate in a sort of like knight and squire affair. On the battlefield, these large combined squads often eschew the bolter for using a chainsword and bolt pistol, due to the Templars' predilection for fighting in close quarters. So let's see how these squads can be used on the tabletop. So Crusader squads are a troop's choice for Codex Black Templars, and as base they are 5 Marines with a Sword Brother and 4 Initiates. They'll cost you 13 points a model, so 1 point more than the standard Tactical Marine now. It can include another 5 Initiates and up to 10 Neophytes. The Neophytes will cost you an additional 11 points each. As standard, every model is armed with a bolt gun and frag and crack grenades. The Initiates all have the standard Tactical Marine stat line, so movement 6, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3 up, strength and toughness 4, 1 wound, 1 attack, leadership 7 and a 3 up save, and the Neophyte scouts have the same except leadership 6 and a 4 up save. The Sword Brother has the standard sergeant profile, so 2 attacks and leadership 8. Probably the most interesting thing with the unit composition is you're able to mix slightly cheaper scouts and slightly more expensive power armoured marines, and you're also able to do it in massive squads of up to 20. A 20-man squad will cost you 240 points with 10 initiates and 10 neophytes. The initiates can swap their bolt gun for a chainsword, which is an interesting option that the standard Tactical Marines in Codex Space Marines don't have. It means your line infantry can essentially be walking assault marines, which is certainly a decent option, seeing as you don't have to give up the bolter unless you want to. I'd be tempted by this if I was fielding them in some way to get them close to the enemy, such as a drop pod or land raider, but otherwise probably stick with the bolt gun, as being able to do some damage to things at range is pretty helpful. The Neophytes can take any of the standard scout options aside from sniper rifles, so they can have a bolt gun, a Starty shotgun, or a combat knife. As with standard scouts, I prefer the bolt gun to the shotgun, just because you do have the option of firing at 24 inches when necessary, and you can potentially get quite a lot of firepower out still with bolter discipline. And of course, having the combat knife means that you can have a very fighty squad indeed, with a lot of attacks in melee. There are some interesting rules with the heavy and special weapons. If you have less than 10 models in the squad, then one initiate can either take a special weapon, such as a melter gun or plasma gun, a heavy weapon, such as a las cannon or heavy bolter or something, or interestingly, a power weapon, so either a power axe, power fist, power maul or power sword. Now the heavy and special weapons are pretty similar to the tactical squads, but having an extra power weapon in the squad is interesting. I typically say that power weapons aren't the strongest buy-in on one attack models, because obviously you're going to get less attacks out of them compared with putting them on sergeants and things. But if you are planning on taking a massive fighter unit of sword brethren and you're planning on stacking some combat buffs on them, then it might not be the worst shout in the world to give one a cheap power sword or something like that. Alternatively, if you have 10 or more models, one initiate can take a special weapon, and then one can either take one of those power weapons or the heavy weapon. So you can have the special weapon and a power weapon, or a special weapon and a heavy weapon, but you can't have a heavy weapon and a power weapon for some reason. Finally, the Sword Brother can take a pair of options from the Sergeant's War Gear list, so this is probably where you want to put a fancy melee weapon first, but I'd also certainly look hard at the Storm Bolter out of this list, as for 2 points for potentially 4 bolter shots a turn is a pretty nice deal. Of course, you can also take your standard combi weapons and all sorts of other bits and bobs, thunderhammers and the like, but my go-to would be a chainsword and a storm bolter for a cheap and effective sergeant. They have the Angels of Death special rule, so Shock Assault for that all-important extra attack in combat on the first round, Combat Doctrines for extra AP on the bolters in the Tactical Doctrine, and extra AP and also those very nice auto-wounding on 6s for the Black Templars Assault Doctrine. Finally, these could benefit from Bolter Discipline quite nicely, if they stay still and are more objective camping rather than charging up in your face. In addition, they have one of their own unique special rules, which is called Paired Combatants. And this rule is, while there's as many initiates as neophytes, when resolving an attack made by a melee weapon by the neophyte in this unit, reroll hit rolls of 1. So a small buff to close combat for the scouts, which is kind of interesting because it means that they'll actually hit better than their masters in close combat, which I do think is quite funny. To be honest, this is really quite a weak buff. It's only a 1/6 damage buff to half the models in the unit or less only when they're in close combat. If you are gearing them up for close combat and buying them some buffing characters, you might well have decent rerolls in close combat anyway. So I think it would have been better to make this a little bit more powerful. But oh well, at least it's fun and flavourful. So overall, the Crusader squad is a very versatile and flexible unit. You could gear it out with 5 men with a heavy weapon to sit back and hold an objective, or you could fill it out to 20 men all with combat weapons to run screaming into the enemy lines. So it certainly has a wide variety of options. Let's talk about some buffs now. In terms of characters, obviously anything that lets the unit have more rerolls will up damage output. So captains, lieutenants, Helbrecht himself, or chaplains with their standard litany in close combat. Black Templars also have all sorts of chaplain litanies that can boost the squad in various ways, from giving them a 5-up feel no pain, to making their melee better and their charges more reliable. Helbrecht and Grimalders also have their own melee buffs. Helbrecht can give them an additional pip of strength, going from strength 4 to strength 5 is very powerful, and Grimalders can allow the unit to get some extra hits in melee too. In terms of stratagems, the Crusader squads can benefit from quite a few. There are plenty of the more standard ones in the Marine book, such as Honour the Chapter to fight again, Transhuman Physiology to survive some heavy firepower, and Steady Advance to move and shoot bolters with bolter discipline, to name just a few. Faith and Fury also gives us a bunch of other options, including Tenacious Assault, the very nice stratagem that will stop an infantry unit from falling back from the Crusader squad, which is most powerful because it means that the enemy won't be able to shoot them in their turn. The Emperor's Will is a stratagem that was basically made for Crusader squads. This is 1 command point, and the unit that's advanced can still shoot their pistol weapons and charge. This could be absolutely massive on a foot-slogging Crusader squad, as an extra 6 inches movement could easily be the difference between making a charge and failing it, and losing out on the attacks of potentially 20 Marines is a really big deal. Vicious Riposte could be used if you're fighting another big infantry unit and want to cause some mortal wounds when they hit you back. And finally, Shock and Awe could well be used when you're coming out of a Land Raider Crusader, preventing overwatch and also giving them some protection in the coming melee by making them -1 to be hit. Some relics could also be helpful, such as the Aurelian Shroud, to give the unit a 4+ invul save for a turn, and the Crusader's Helm, to put the unit in Assault Doctrine before it would otherwise be able to do so. Finally, Frontline Commander, the Warlord trait that allows +1 to advance and charge, also combos really well and could well be used with the Emperor's Will stratagem to make them have a very, very long advance and charge threat range indeed. So how would I use a Crusader squad on the tabletop? I think there are certainly a few different ways that you can build them. You could certainly just use them as backfield gunline units, toting a heavy weapon. You could field them in greater numbers and try and push up the board in a massive power armour. Or you could think about using a Land Raider Crusader, Rhino or Drop Pod to get a melee squad where they need to be. Unfortunately, in terms of a backline gunline unit, tactical squads just do this flat better as they have the same profile and just cost 1 point less per model. So unless you're just going for a list that only runs Crusader squads, there's no real tactical reason to run a backline gunline squad as Crusaders rather than tactical Marines. If you're going for a sea of Marines charging up the table on some sort of foot crusade, I could easily see bolters or chainswords being reasonably effective, the trade-off being whether you want a few smashing of shots as you advance, or whether you just want to hit really hard if and when you get there. If you were going this route, I would be tempted to make a really quite big squad, perhaps push it towards 15 or 20 models, because big squads can have some decent advantages when you're trying to seize ground up the table. The main downside of this is morale, which usually isn't a factor for Space Marines, but you might actually need to think about it, maybe including chaplains to support them, to mitigate that negative. If you're going this way, I'd certainly think about using that frontline commander warlord trait to get them to charge up the board faster than they would normally be able to. Finally, we come to transport. In terms of delivering a melee squad, my favourite would be the drop pod, as it synergises very well with the Black Templars' innate boosted charge rolls, and will pretty much guarantee a strike turn 1. The main disadvantage of Rhinos and Land Raider Crusaders is that the transports can't move on the turn that they disembark, meaning that you're going to have at least one turn where the transport's going to be rolling forward, meaning that your opponent has another turn to either deal with the threat or pull back from it before your Marines can catch up with them. Plus, Land Raider Crusaders are quite expensive models, and if they are tagged in close combat themselves, then all of their shooting becomes useless. If we're talking purely from a competitive perspective, I don't really think that the fluffy Land Raider Crusader and Crusader squad combination is completely optimal, but it certainly is a fun combo if you're going for a more fluffy list, and that nice shock and awe stratagem certainly helps. So, if I was building a big melee Crusader squad, I think that the Initiates and the Neophytes are fairly well balanced in terms of points cost to what you get out of them. The Initiates are a decent bit more tough with the 3-up armor save, but then the Neophytes are decently cheaper. My personal preference would be to run the max amount of Neophytes possible, as at least then you get access to that reroll ones in close combat, and you could potentially have the slightly tougher Initiates tank shots for the Neophytes, so you still have decent melee when you get to close combat, and have taken a lot more saves on the 3-up armor. If I was gearing them up for melee, I'd most certainly take a fancy melee weapon on the Sword Brethren, and I'd probably consider either a special or a power weapon on the rest of the squad, mainly because it's likely to be safe to do its work for a few turns, while the enemy has to work to chew through all of the models. I'd say a reasonable build would be 8 Initiates with bolters, and 8 Neophytes with combat blades. The reason I put the bolters on the Initiates would be that I'd be taking more saves on the 3-up power armor, meaning that they're less likely to reach close combat, so they may as well have a bolt gun to try and contribute to the game before they're killed. Say if the enemy had enough firepower to blow away half the squad, I'd prefer to be taking it on the 3-up armor saves to limit casualties, and then maybe by turn 2 or turn 3, once that depleted unit reaches close combat, it'll still be fighting it as hard as it can, as all of the remaining weapons will have close combat weapons. I'd most certainly be wanting to run them alongside Captains, Lieutenants, Helbrecht or Grimaldus to maximise their damage output as they walk up the battlefield. Or if we were putting them in a Land Raider Crusader, I'd certainly consider a fighty character, maybe Helbrecht, maybe the Emperor's Champion, to go along with them, so they can deliver a lot more of the damage output, while these guys screen for them. I'd be wanting to deploy them fairly far forward in the deployment zone, ideally in cover if there's any opportunity to, but if I couldn't, say I was running too many of these power armoured models, I'd certainly be considering prepared positions. I'd be wanting to surround my buffing characters with multiple units like this, and then push forward to dominate the midfield, and take the fight to the enemy. I'd certainly make sure I had a captain or other character with the frontline commander warlord trait, to get all of these models up the board as quick as possible and hopefully into melee. Once there, I'd certainly be thinking to make use of any situational stratagems such as Honour the Chapter to fight again, and Tenacious Assault to lock a unit in close combat. So how do Crusader squads compare with the competition? I'm afraid from a list optimization perspective they are a bit lacking, and I wouldn't actually field them myself at all outside fun and fluffy games, which is a perfectly valid reason. The main problem, as is often the case with Space Marines, is that they have too many competitors that do the same job but a bit better. If you want Marines with bolters, then Tactical Marines are now 12 points, whereas your Initiates are 13 points, and they have exactly the same rules. If you want Scout bodies, you can still buy regular Scout squads. They're also 11 points, but they have the option to set up outside of their deployment zone, so could potentially be getting first turn charges, which is a lot better than slogging all the way up the board. And if you wanted to fill out a Land Raider Crusader full of nasty fighty Space Marines, I'd be looking more towards veterans for that role. because they're only one more point than the Initiates, but you get an entire extra attack and far more options in terms of war gear. I'd say the most unique thing that the Crusader squad has going for it is that you can take it in 20 model units, which is a powerful ability. And if you are running a fun horde list, it certainly does have viability above tactical squads and things. I honestly just wish that Games Workshop had pointed the Initiates at 12 points, like the regular tactical marines, because frankly they aren't really any better. So I think that was a bit of an oversight on their part. All that being said, they're still Space Marines. Space Marines are very good at the moment, so by running one of their slightly less optimised units, you certainly won't really be doing yourself too much of a disservice. I definitely put them more on the fun and fluffy sort of a spectrum, rather than hardcore optimised tournament options, but I'm sure that many people will have had games where Crusader squads absolutely do the Emperor's work and sweep all before them. Please let me know if I'm missing anything, or you have any particular strategy that makes these guys punch above their weight. And please correct me if I've got any rules wrong or anything like that down in the comments below. If you'd like to hear more videos like this, then please feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have regular Space Marine content out pretty much every day, and we'll certainly be covering other Psychic Awakening books as they come out. Also, please feel free to support my Patreon if you are finding my content useful, as making all these videos does take a very long time. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.